As you can see, the title for today's webinar is How to Fly with a Sex Toy Under TSA Rules, describing the rules that exist for the TSA, which surprisingly are very few when it comes to these sorts of items. But more importantly, how other rules of the TSA may come to haunt folks who are flying with personal items, either in their carry-on bags or in their checked luggage. Now, two of the things that people worry about when they travel is the TSA getting into their personal business. They can do so, as the picture on the left illustrates, by going into your bags, whether it's a checked bag or carry-on bag, or because they're giving way too much scrutiny to an item that you have. In this particular picture, the TSA screener seems to be holding a Rubik's Cube, which is definitely not a sex toy and quite legal. And like the Rubik's Cube, most items which are designated as sex toys are actually quite legal. There's absolutely no restriction whatsoever on flying with them in the US. The current situation is sex toys are not specifically mentioned by the TSA at all. And items which are used either primarily as a sex toy or as a secondary purpose as a sex toy, the only limits that apply are the limits that apply on any item that you would carry. There are limits due to security concerns, and there are limits due to other specific restrictions on materials, size of materials, etc. However, there are times when those limits are open to TSA interpretation, and that's one of the areas where there are problems that come up. This is an issue in part for a couple of reasons. One, confusion over TSA rules. As I'll explain later on, there are a variety of rules that the TSA has, although they're rather extensive and they're rather public about putting those rules out there for people to see. They're often hard to find. You have to dig deep into the TSA's rule book, into their website rather, to find out what may or may not be restricted. The enforcement is also inconsistent, in part because the interpretation of what is or is not within the rules is left up to often the individual TSA screener. And what may be perfectly legal by their written rules, they could, without any reason whatsoever, state that an item or more than one item in your baggage or in your pockets can't be taken on board the airplane. This is typically a problem that happens with carry-on bags. Check bags happen to have a lot more leeway with respect to what you can or can't carry in the check bag. And only under rare circumstances will something be removed from a check bag because it violates the TSA rules. There's also a lack of an unambiguous policy when it comes to these sorts of things. That is, while the TSA has very clear policies over items that are allowed or materials that are allowed, they don't have a clear policy that states basically you can, unless there are violations of other restrictions, carry whatever you want as a personal item on board the aircraft, specifically sex toys. They don't mention that, or at least I have not seen that mentioned in any of the formal TSA documentation. And by the way, for the benefit of everyone there, online right now, if you can, if you can type a question into the question box or into the chat box that's on your administrative screen, I'll be able to answer it during the presentation here. And by the way, misbehavior of TSA officials is another item we'll get into later. Sometimes they violate their own rules and they violate personal privacy. And when that happens, there are steps that you can take. Here's an example of potential TSA rule confusion. As it turns out, this month the TSA released a proposed change in the rules as to what you can take on board the aircraft with respect to knives. Now, since 9/11, essentially all knives, with very rare exceptions, let's say very short plastic ones used for your in-flight meal, for instance, knives were banned from the passenger cabin, period, no matter how long they were. That rule's been relaxed. As of later this month, there will be an allowance for certain kinds of knives. The blade has to be a certain length. It has to have a certain function to it. For example, as you can see from the graphic here, your classic Swiss Army knife is allowed, but any kind of knife that has a fixed blade is not allowed. Any kind of knife with a folding handle isn't allowed, etc., etc. And of course, there's the width of the knife. The knife can't be wider than, I believe, half an inch wide. Well, you can see what the potential for confusion may be. There could be someone who has a knife that is actually fitting within these guidelines, but because the policy is so new, the TSA person that you run into may not be aware of it and may categorically put all the knives into the prohibited column simply because they're not aware of the nuances of the new change. This is something that's happening with knives. It's happened for a long time with sex toys. Now, another issue we have is the public's perception of what's going on with sex toys in the TSA. This is an article from earlier this month in the New York Post Uh, uh, for those of you who are not familiar with it, the New York Post is one of the major daily newspapers in New York City, and they often have, let's say, eye-catching headlines. And this was an article that had a short interview with several passengers who had been hassled by the TSA. Either comments said to them or their baggage was picked out of a group of passengers for extra searching because they were traveling with sex toys. Now, the people who were interviewed are sex educators who travel with these around the country, and they've had plenty of experience going through TSA, and all of them had some experience with the TSA doing something that was inappropriate, making comments, spending too much time on it, etc., not treating their baggage as they would other people. Now, granted, these folks are not the average passenger. The average passenger probably doesn't carry as many items or as frequently as these passengers did, but their issues are the same issues that people face on a daily basis. The risks faced by passengers include violation of privacy. That is, unless there's a reason for the TSA to deal with your item, you're free to carry whatever you want, whatever outfit you want, whatever color of outfit you want, whatever legal item that you can carry that doesn't violate security rules or other restricted item rules. The TSA is not in a position to comment on it. So if they do make a comment about what you're carrying, they're in violation of their own rules. Another problem, and this isn't necessarily the TSA misbehaving, this is often due to misunderstanding of what the rules are, being forced to discard valuable items. Because as the next point says, missed flights due to security delays. If you have a situation, you go to the security line and the screener says, this particular item can't be allowed, you can't take it in your carry-on bag. Well, your choices are you can leave the security line, go check it into a check bag if you have checked baggage that you haven't checked in already, or find another bag to serve as checked baggage, check it in at the counter, come back in the line, get on your airplane. If you're like most people, you probably don't arrive at the airport with plenty of time to completely leave the line, join another line at the counter, check something in, then get back in the security line. And your other option may be to somehow or another ship it through some other means, mailbox, etc. But again, if you're at the airport in a hurry and you haven't planned for it, you typically have the time and the resources to actually mail something out or send it UPS or what have you. And also there's a risk of theft, loss, or damage. That is, while the agents are going through your bags, they could take something out, put it on the side for extra scrutiny, you forget about it, you leave it behind, or, which has happened, TSA agent may actually steal your item from your bag. And there are things you can do to help prevent this from happening, and certainly things to do that you can do once it does happen. One of the easiest ways that you as a passenger can get around these problems is to become familiar with the TSA rules, which is part of the reason this webinar is happening. Take actions to avoid problems. That is, there are some things that people do that consistently solve or result in problems. If you avoid those or make them less likely to happen, you're less likely to have a problem. Another thing you have to do is be prepared to deal with the common problems you might come across when carrying carry-on or checked baggage in. That is, what if an item is not allowed to go through? Well, there are things that you can do. Above all, you must insist on your privacy, your dignity, and respect. The TSA has the right to go through your luggage, even the right to do a pat-down search. They don't have a right to make a public spectacle of it, to embarrass you in front of strangers by holding up an item from your carry-on bag and what have you. A brief explanation, what's a sex toy? There's a couple of general definitions that we can use here. There are products that are intended for use to aid, as an aid for sexual stimulation or expression. There's also objects or devices primarily used to enhance or facilitate sexual pleasure. So your classic sex toy could be any number of things that you can imagine. And there are other things that could be used for sexual expression, and they're not necessarily sex toys. And again, when it comes to TSA, it doesn't really matter what kind of object it is, whether it's specifically designed for that or is used for that, even though it doesn't have that design. For example, some people like to wear handcuffs for fun. The handcuffs, depending on what they look like, could be your classic police handcuffs. They're not designed as sex toys, but they're used as a sex toy by some. Again, doesn't really matter to the TSA. Either it fits the description of a prohibited item or restricted item, or it doesn't. Doesn't really matter what you're using that item for. Basic sex toy laws, mostly legal in the US. Things may vary from various localities in various states that may restrict the sale, distribution, or ownership. But when it comes to air travel, which is under federal jurisdiction, there are no restrictions. It doesn't matter what happens outside the terminal. If you're flying on an airliner and you're going through security, TSA only cares about federal rules. And the rules may be different outside of the US. That goes for almost anything. But if one's traveling within the US, there's one set of rules you have to be careful of. If you're traveling elsewhere, you have to be a bit more careful. We'll get into that later. They're basic sex toy categories. It's designed to be used as a sex toy. It's not designed to be used as a sex toy, but people are using it anyway. They're accessories that are used with sex toys. And there are potential TSA issues in all categories. A bit on the TSA. Their purpose is to provide security. They do that by screening passengers and baggage. They have no law enforcement power. So although they may be able to confiscate your device, they can't arrest you for it. Trust me, if you do something that's a violation of law, they'll get in touch with law enforcement. But typically, if you're concerned with the TSA, one thing you don't have to be concerned about. They're not cops. They're not police officers. They don't have the power. They don't have the training. What they can do is control access of people and goods inside of airport terminals and inside of aircraft. They can check your travel documents. They can screen you physically and with x-ray machines and other devices. They can screen your carry-on items. They can screen your checked items. Most likely problems you'll have with the TSA is that you have delays due to volume. That is, there are too many passengers coming through to deal with in a short period of time. You may have an extra long wait in line. You may have problems due to secondary screening. That is, if something comes up during your initial screen, either your documents or your checked items or something in your pockets, you may be pulled aside for additional questions, additional screening, and potential delays. Dealing with restricted items. If you happen to have an item that the TSA considers to be restricted, you have to deal with it. Typically, you have to leave it behind. There's also loss, damage, and theft of items. Anytime you have someone go through your baggage, there's always the potential of something happening, especially something getting damaged or lost or stolen. And of course, there's the improper TSA behavior. TSA is filled with human beings. Sometimes they do things they shouldn't do. Risk reduction strategies, which is common for all kinds of travel, is avoid them entirely. That is, take steps to avoid the potential problem. Make the problem less likely to happen should you have a situation where there's a potential problem. Make the effects less severe and have a plan to deal with those problems. Throughout this webinar, you'll see that we'll follow this procedure, this philosophy when it comes to identifying and addressing the various problems related to sex toys and TSA. For those of you who are subscribers to the mailing list, you will get access to these three latest books that I wrote: the airsafe.com Baggage and Security Guide, the airsafe.com Airline Complaint Guide, and the airsafe.com Family Air Travel Guide. While only the first book has anything in it specifically about sex toys, all the books may have some aspect of it that may be relevant to your air travel needs. For the middle book, obviously, if you have a problem with the TSA, complaining is something you'd like to do. And we have a very extensive resource section in there, not only for how to complain to the TSA, but specifically how to complain if you have some sort of civil rights type of violation or other sorts of improper behavior by a TSA representative. Delays are one of the more popular, likely problems that happen. And the easiest way to deal with delays is just to plan for it. That is, arrive with some extra time in your pocket. So in case there is a problem, it won't cause a problem for you. And the books that I mentioned in the previous slide, there are sections there that have specific strategies if you're traveling, how much time to give for security purposes. You give more time if you have check bags, more time if you have multiple bags, more time if you're traveling with a large group. We break it down for you. Now, typically, if you only use carry-on bags, you'll have less of a problem with delays because you have less to worry about. Packing less is always a good idea for delays and for other reasons. When it comes to secondary screenings, for whatever reason, follow the TSA instructions. Even if you don't agree with the instructions, even if you think what they're doing isn't justified given what you're trying to carry through, just follow what they want you to do. Of course, ahead of time, become familiar with the restrictions so you don't come into any problem areas with that. And pack your carry-ons for easy screening. I'm not saying do it completely for the TSA benefit, but for example, if you know you have an item that may cause questions to be asked, put that item in a convenient place so as soon as they open the bag, there it is. For example, goes to the x-ray screener, they see something on the TV monitor, and they pull your bag aside and say, hey, what's in the bag? Well, if you open up the bag and it's right there, it's a very quick explanation, you're on your way. And above all, if you're asked about something, tell the truth. Common triggers are metallic items in your clothes or on your body, larger metallic items in your bags, and anything in the x-ray image that may show up as an odd-looking shape or suspicious shape. And again, that's up to the interpretation of the TSA person, and in most cases, completely benign articles may be the cause of them pulling the bag aside. So if your bag is pulled aside, don't worry about it if you haven't done anything that's illegal or against TSA regulations. Those general restrictions are weapons, liquids, gels, and aerosols that are larger than, let's say, 3 ounces in size, potentially hazardous materials, and my favorite, the judgment of the screener. Some of them have very good judgment, others don't. We're talking about human beings here. Your most important restrictions are those that are not allowed in the aircraft at all as checked or carry-on baggage. Outside of explosives, almost anything you can think of can be carried in one form or another inside of an airplane if it's properly packed and doesn't have any other hazardous or dangerous aspects to it, and specifically is within the guidelines of the TSA. There are things that are only allowed in checked bags. There are also things that are only allowed in carry-on bags but not checked bags. But most likely you're going to have the first two kinds of restrictions, not allowed in the aircraft at all or allowed only in checked bags. As mentioned earlier, if you have a restricted item and you discover that during the screening process, you may have to discard it, ship it through some alternative means, or put it in a check bag. And not everything that comes into that becomes a problem is going to be on TSA's list, because the TSA does not have an exhaustive list of every possible item that people can carry in an aircraft. People are very creative. They carry all kinds of things. The TSA screener, even if you disagree with them, has the final say in whether something can or can't go on the airplane. And if it's a situation where it has to be discarded and there is no bad behavior or improper behavior by the TSA, that is simply your loss. You'll have to eat the cost, whatever it may be. Now, this is more of an issue for accessories that people may carry with them as opposed to an actual toy or object. If you have any kind of container for fluid, liquid, gel, aerosol, it has to be fairly small, 100 milliliters, 3.4 ounces. Also, items that could potentially be used as weapons, and that's a pretty broad category. For example, a baseball bat. You can't carry that in your carry-on bags. You can carry it as checked luggage because it has a potential to be a weapon. There's also a general rule, the 7-inch rule for hand tools. That is, if you have some hand-sized tool, screwdriver, wrench, etc., if it's 7 inches or less, you'll be okay. That size limit may also apply to metallic objects, including metallic sex toys. To give you an example of what 7 inches is, this next slide has a $100 bill. U.S. currency is all the same size, so whether you have a $1 bill or a $100 bill, it's the same size. As you can see from the yellow lines there, $100 bill is just over 6 inches long. So basically, if you have something that's longer than a $100 bill, it may be a problem. You may want to measure it and make sure it's within the rules. The following is an example pulled from, I believe it was Amazon.com, which has quite an extensive collection of sex toys. This is turns out it's a metallic sex toy. Personally, I thought it was an art object of some sort. I wouldn't have known this was a sex toy unless you told me. But as it turns out, this item is about 7.5 inches long. It's made of metal. If you had this in your carry-on bag and you happen to go through, the TSA person sees this, they pull it out and they measure it. It says, sorry, you can't bring this on. It's metallic and over 7 inches of length. Well, you can complain all you want and say it has an innocent use, but that TSA screener would be perfectly within his or her rights to say, I can't allow this on the airplane. Now, it turns out the list price for this item is over $100, so it'll be cheaper just to hand a $100 bill over to the TSA than to try and put this in your carry-on bag. Moral of the story, if you have something that is longer than 7 inches in metal, either don't bring it in your carry-on bag at all and put it in check bags, or don't bring it at all on your trip, or you'll run the risk of having it confiscated if it's in your carry-on bag or in your pocket. A few words on secondary screening. It happens if an alarm gets triggered. The alarm could be from your bag, could be from something in your pocket, could be you left your belt on, they told you to take your belt off because the buckle's made of metal. And it's not related to the bag screen. That is, your bag can go through just fine. If you personally have something on your body that triggers an alarm, you'll have to go through a search, which could include a pat-down search. You can request privacy, especially if you have anything, for example, piercings and whatnot on the body that you may not want to be seen by other people. You can request a screened off area, separate room, whatever the case may be at that airport. If you have a secondary screening of your bag, common sense rules, no matter what the situation, keep your bag in sight. If you have items that could be causing a potential secondary screening, if you can, put them in some sort of clear packaging so they'll clearly know what it is without taking it out and handling it. For example, if you have a personal item that you don't want a TSA person to touch, put it in a clear container of some kind, Ziploc bag, etc. And if you're asked, clearly describe what it is. Don't say it's something that it's not. If it is a sex toy, say it's a sex toy. Believe me, they've seen it all, and they're not going to, well, they may be embarrassed by it, but they have no right to treat you differently just because it's a sex toy. Keep valuables out of sight. Point out fragile items if you're having your, by the way, I have a misspelling there. Point out that fragile items if you have them in your bag. Keep your eyes on your bags at all times. And if there's another potential issue, let's say there's something in the corner that may break easily or may tear easily or may cause a problem because it's misinterpreted, identify those ahead of time with the screener who's searching through your bag so you have fewer problems. Check bag issues. If you have something fragile, if you can, put it in carry-ons. It's easier to keep track of it and keep track of how it's being handled that way. If you have valuable items or items that are very hard to replace, for example, eyeglasses, prescription medicine, manuscripts, anything that you don't want to be lost, it's best to keep it in carry-on bags. If you have a lost item, whether it's from your carry-on or from the check bag, report it immediately to the appropriate authority. And if you check a bag, with rare exceptions, you have to keep your bag unlocked. Those two exceptions are if you have a lock that's approved by the TSA, where TSA basically has a master key, or if you're flying with firearms, which are required to be in a locked, hard-sided container. That was the subject of last week's webinar. If you go to airsafe.com and search for firearms, you'll probably find that video. It's also on the airsafe.com YouTube channel. What are some improper TSA behaviors? Drawing attention to your personal item. They shouldn't do that. They're personal items. They're called that for a reason. It's your business. It's the TSA's business to look at it, but it's not the TSA's business to broadcast it to the world. Making inappropriate comments, either verbal or written, either to you personally or to someone else. They're not in the business of commenting about your personal habits. If you hear them doing it or see them doing it, it's a reportable sort of offense, including leaving inappropriate messages, which we'll talk about in a minute, and anything else that appears to be unprofessional and uncalled for. Now, back in 2011, there was a woman named Jill Filipovich who was traveling and had a sex toy of some type in her checked bag. Now, as is usually the case, when the TSA opens a checked bag for their random inspection, they will leave a note in there saying, basically, we've opened your bag, etc., etc. It's a boilerplate sort of message. This TSA screener decided to write an additional message on it. Get your freak on, girl. Make a long story short, this became a very public event, very widely reported in the media, and the TSA person responsible for writing this message was fired. Just because it happened once doesn't mean it's not going to happen again. If you see something like this happen with your check bag, report it. Sex toys and check bags. Again, the same rule I would apply for any other item. If it's fragile, be careful about how you pack it. Leave your bag unlocked or use an approved TSA lock. File a claim if it's lost or damaged. And as we illustrated before, the TSA will leave a note if the bag's opened. Dealing with improper TSA behaviors. This works in almost any situation. You run into a situation during your passenger screening. something's out of the ordinary, ask for a supervisor. If you have witnesses in your traveling party, have them bear witness to what's going on, have them take pictures, take sound recordings. If you are not satisfied with what the supervisor does about the situation or with the situation overall, you can always file a formal complaint. And later on, much like what Jill Filipovich did with her situation, make others aware of the incident, make it less likely that it will occur in the future. International travel presents its own particular problems, and this isn't just with sex toys. This is with almost any article that tends to be restricted, alcohol, cigarettes, etc. First of all, the kind of security restrictions you see with the TSA are fairly common around the world. That is, large metallic items may not be allowed in many countries. Large liquid containers, over 3.4 ounces, may be restricted by many countries. However, specific laws vary widely by country. And if you're traveling, especially if you're changing planes overseas, you have to be aware of the basic laws of the country you're traveling from, the country you're traveling to, and any country where you change planes, because you can run into problems anytime you have to come under the scrutiny of that country's security services or immigration and naturalization type services. That is, if they have to examine your bags for any reason, they can point you out or point out one of your items for violating that country's laws. When it comes to sex toys and international travel, you have to take some other things into account. One thing that you can pretty much be assured of is that TSA type security restrictions are common around the world with respect to large metal objects, liquids, gels, aerosols, etc. However, laws when it comes to sex toys vary widely by country. In that while it's quite legal in the United States to travel with a sex toy, it may not be legal in other places. And in other places, you may have the equivalent of the TSA or other security services take a dim view of it, even if it is quite legal in that country, and you may be hassled in ways that you wouldn't dream of being hassled in the United States. But in general, you should review the laws of your departure country, your arrival country, and any country where you change planes, because in any of those places, you could be subject to a typical security search, and you may run afoul of the laws of those countries. And for example, if you're traveling to Asia and you're changing planes in Tokyo, it's very common for the Tokyo officials to put you through security screening again, going through your checked bags and taking out any items that they consider to be not allowed. So be careful when you travel and make sure you know where you go, what the laws are. For additional information about sex toys and other travel issues, please go to sextoy.airsafe.com. We've got links to related information, including in the future a link to the video of this webinar. You can download our Fear of Flying Guide, which has some information about stresses that may be associated with flying. And in this case, it has little to do often with the actual risk of flying from physical injury or death. Very often, the fear people have is fear, for example, fear of a violation of their privacy, fear of having something confiscated. If it's causing you consternation, if it's causing you stress, and it's part of the flying experience, this guide could be useful to you. And of course, if you subscribe to the mailing list, you'll get access to these 3 books, as well as other ebooks by myself or published at airsafe.com. For that, please go to subscribe.airsafe.com. If you already are a subscriber, just look at your most recent email from the mailing list and you'll see a link to the page that has these books. We thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next time.